Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, co-editor-in-chief of Retail Insider. Joining me today is Kelly Higginson, who is president and CEO of Restaurants Canada. Thanks, Kelly, for joining us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Mario.
Okay, you folks put out a quarterly report recently, and some disturbing data in there regarding the industry, food service industry in Canada. Let's talk
Sure.
about that. Um, how bad is it out there right now for that industry in terms of profitability?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to mislead and say that, we're falling off of a cliff because that's not fair to the sector and nor is it accurate, but it's an incredibly challenging period for sure. And I think we're seeing that in the wider economy as well, which then impacts our consumers' ability to spend in restaurants. And I think we consider ourselves an early indicator. Canadians, the first thing that they will have to cut back on is restaurant spending when they are pinched with their discretionary spending. And of course, as we know, Canadians have been negotiating an affordability, a chronic affordability issue for quite some time. And so what we saw really in the Q4 of the last quarter of last year was a bit of a double whammy. We had Canadians pulling back on their spending, but what we also saw in that last quarter was the retaliatory tariff impacts on our costs continuing to go up. And that was very impactful, but we also knew that we couldn't pass that on to the consumer. I think if we look at the full year, as you saw in the report, we were able to buffer some of the discretionary spending challenges because we had a sales increase with the GST holiday in January and February early in the year. We saw the March break. We had an increase in the usual spending year on year because Canadians were staying closer to home. There was a bit more of an anti-US sentiment happening and changing of vacation plans. And we again saw that in throughout the summer. But again, those cost increases continuing to rise for us really made it difficult for us to take advantage of any increase in sales. And so we really saw our bottom lines impacted by this.
How many, what percentage, and I think I've seen something like around 50% uh, of restaurants are on the brink, so to speak.
Yes, so as of November 2025, we have 44% of restaurants are operating at a loss or barely breaking even, and this is up from 41% in June 2025. So we saw it creep up, through the summer and into the early fall. But what is really important for people to understand is this is an incredibly sharp contrast to our 2019 levels, where they always kind of hung around 12%. 10 to 12% pre-2019 was pretty average for us. And we just have not been able to break that, into the high 40s. We were sitting at 53% for a good amount of time in 2024. So we've got that right now sitting at around 44, 45% of restaurants are operating at a loss or barely breaking even. But another piece of it was 60% of operators reported that profitability in 2025 was worse or much worse than expected compared with 2024 because of those rising operating costs, which just continued to narrow their margins.
hmm Now, I don't know if you have this data, Kelly, but I know I recently saw something from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business about
Mhm.
looking at Stats Canada numbers on closures versus openings of businesses. And there was a disturbing trend there that the number of closures was, outpacing the number of openings.
Mhm.
Can you say anything about that in the terms of the restaurant industry?
So we haven't got drilled down data on that, and as you can imagine, it gets harder the narrower the data that you want to get from Stats Canada. But we will be able to have that within some good time. Stats Canada is a little bit slower on some of the data from last year, so once we get a handle on that, we'll certainly have the information. But I think it's fair to say that we do what we usually sit around is that one opening, one closing. But I think based on what we're seeing, we expect to see probably that slip into a bit of a higher closing level. The the thing that I think is important for people to understand is you're never going to see mass closures because of the lifetime of a lease. So a lot of these independent operators are really stuck with and married to these leases. They've got personal guarantees, they've got, their personal finances tied to these commercial leases. So some of them just have to hold on and they're falling into that 44% of operators operating at a loss or barely breaking even. But they really have no choice but to just hold on until that lease comes up or they face significant penalties. So, it is one of those things that we'll start to see this creep in a bit slowly, and then we'll have some data on this. But it always is a bit of a challenging time for us as we wait for this type of data, knowing the challenges that our operators are having right now.
One of the things that surprises me, and I'm based in Calgary, and I see, yes, restaurants close, but a lot of them open, right?
Yeah.
And I'm always amazed that despite those challenging obstacles out there, that people still are opening restaurants. Why is that?
Well, I think it's for a couple reasons. One, it really is a great business. And look, we're the fourth largest private employer. There's over 100,000 operators, businesses across the country. And at the end of the day, 23, I think we're actually up to 24 million Canadians visit a restaurant every day.
Hmm.
So there's something to be said for that, right? And look, while we're at this challenging number of 44% of restaurants operating at a loss or barely breaking even, there's also the flip side of that. So I don't want to cover up the fact that we have a lot of successful restaurants. I think what we're seeing right now is some restaurants shifting their concept, meeting the consumer where they're at. We've seen, I know in some of the areas that I visit and in Toronto in particular lately, we've seen a number of higher end restaurants shifting towards something that might be a bit more of a casual bar. They're shifting to a mid-level type of restaurant. And I think while people might bemoan that as the end of dining, that's really not it at all. It's really meeting the consumer where they're at, and that's our job as business operators, right? To make sure that we're doing that and responding to the need of the consumer. So, I think we're going to see some shifts. I do think that unfortunately we may lose businesses for sure. And this is something that we talk to the government about because it is important for our governments to understand the impact on the wider economy. As the fourth largest employer, we're an incredibly labor intensive industry, and 40% of our workforce is youth. So there's a lot of impacts when a restaurant is cutting shifts, cutting hours of operations, just barely getting by, or having to close because you're going to see that direct impact on the local economy. You're going to see that direct impact in Canadian agriculture. We purchase more than 50% of the Canadian agriculture sales. So there's a lot of areas where we are incredibly impactful to the wider economy and to those local communities that we support.
Hmm. The other thing that amazes me is I look at some of the big food groups like like the Foodtastic and
Mhm.
Happy Belly food group.
Yeah,
They're growing like crazy. Like
yeah.
and is there more of a buffer? Do you think being a franchisee that you have the support that can get you through the tough times or?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a few things. Definitely, you have some power in ordering. That definitely does help. You have support from a corporate level, so you're not out all on your own, which is very difficult and daunting when you think about how fast-paced things change now, whether that's technology, whether that's, some of the marketing supports that you can get from those corporate offices to help you and support you. It makes for a little bit more of a manageable environment for those operators to be operating with that support from a corporate entity. I think the other piece of it too is if we look at some of the restaurants that are doing really well and that concept level. So if you look at these larger groups, Foodtastic, they have a wide variety of different restaurant concepts under their umbrella, right? So while some of their concepts might not be doing gangbusters right now, the other ones are probably doing okay and can help support. So, I think there's a lot of reasons why you're still seeing the bit of success there, but I can say that this survey goes out to, I mean, the response level was in the high 7,000s businesses, and it was a really good cross section of chains, franchisees, independent businesses. So this snapshot is really telling the picture of challenges across the board right now from the cost perspective of operating these businesses.
Yeah, last question I had for you is when you look at the government, federal government, what are the main things as a group, Restaurants Canada is asking the federal government to do to help support the industry in these challenging times?
Sure, there's a few things that we're in, pretty deep conversations with, and it'll flip whether that's federal or regionally. But federally, we're looking, and we've been running a pretty strong campaign of permanently exempting all food from GST to boost restaurant spending and help Canadians with affordability. And I think what we saw during the GST holiday was that almost 10% increase in sales in restaurant spending. But more importantly, what we saw was a significant increase in job creation. So in January and February, we created as a sector last year almost 24,000 positions, which is a time of year we're usually shedding jobs, cutting shifts. It's a really slow time of year across the country. So again, try and talk about the immediate impact of restaurants stimulating the local economy. And that's one area that we think it would check some boxes is to permanently remove GST from all food. I think the other thing that we're working on that's really important, especially to our rural, remote, and tourism regions, we're this vast, large country, but we're not heavily populated in a lot of it. So we're working on workforce policies to address the unique staffing needs geographically in those areas and tourism areas because we can see a boost in tourism. The government can be pretty excited about that, growth in tourism, but we're not going to be able to benefit from it if we don't have employees to be able to service that increase in tourists coming to the area. So we're talking about geographical areas where the full-time population is 2 to 4,000 people, and it balloons into 40,000 during their high season. So very unique staffing needs. In these areas. So we're working closely on some policies to try and address these areas. And then overall, it's the how do we reduce the cost of doing business? EI premiums. We were talking regionally about different tax levels, small business tax, alcohol tax. There's a number of areas in wholesale alcohol, how we can expand those offerings. So there's a number of areas where we can work closely with the government and different governments about around these issues.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Kelly, for joining us today.
Anytime, Mario. It's always good to see you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was Kelly Higginson, who is President, CEO of Restaurants Canada. I'm Mario Toneguzzi, co-editor in chief of Retail Insider. Thanks for joining us today.